Good afternoon. Welcome to the Mater Hospital here in Dublin. My name is Sister Eugene. I'm a Sister of Mercy, and I've spent most of my life here at the Mater. So I'm very pleased to have the privilege of telling you something about this wonderful hospital. This is the oldest picture that I could find of the hospital, and it's interesting insofar as it shows you how they brought patients to the hospital when there were no ambulances in existence. That little cart there was carrying a patient to the hospital, and the entrance was down under the steps of the hospital. And they were somewhat privileged to get any form of transport to the hospital because many of the patients had to be carried on the backs of people, carried on hand-pulled carts. This one has a little donkey in front of it, and they were either very ill or they had the privilege of having such a means of conveyance. The Sisters of Mercy founded the Mater, and there's a lot of reason behind why they did it. They were founded by Catherine Macaulay, a Dublin lady like myself. She founded them in Baggot Street in 1831, and it was her idea to build a hospital. After they were founded, one of the important things that the sisters decided they should do was care for the sick poor. And they found by and large that the sick poor were ending up in the basements and worse still out on the roads, just thrown out of the tenements if they were living there. Now, you can understand how that would be the case because there were up to 10 in a room in some of the tenement houses in Dublin. The largest tenement area of all Europe was in Dublin. So rather than have them spread whatever disease they had among those who were living in the tenements, it was safer to push them out of the place altogether. So Catherine Macaulay, her sisters tried to get them into some of the other Dublin hospitals, and they failed, mainly because they were poor and nobody felt they had any obligation to do anything for them. So one day, Catherine Macaulay said, I think the only solution to this problem is that we build a hospital of our own, where the only criterion for admission would be that they were sick. We won't ask them what religion they are, we won't ask them if they have money in their pocket, we merely will look at them, decide if they're sick and take them in. So that was exactly as she decided to do it, and unfortunately she died very shortly after that. But she left very powerful women behind her, and the one who actually built the Mater was Mother Vincent Whitty. And she in herself was a great woman too. First of all, the Mater was built on the north side of the city, in close proximity to the largest overcrowded tenement area in all Europe. That was down off Dorset Street, which is at the bottom of Eccles Street, and the Mater is on Eccles Street. The hospital addressed the greatest need in the city, somewhere the sick poor could go without having to know somebody. This was the big problem that the sick poor were up against. They had to know somebody or they had to be able to pay money, and very often they neither knew somebody nor were they able to pay money. Generally in those days, people who were sick were thrown out, and therefore this had to be dealt with. In 1861, the nuns provided nursing care. They didn't employ staff as such. They went ahead, while the hospital was being built, some of the nuns went to France. They went there for two reasons. They went there to learn nursing in Paris, and they went to Amiens to learn hospital administration. and therefore they were in a position to be able to nurse and train other nuns that came along, because the School of Nursing didn't open for many years after that. What they did was, and the only facility that they had, was to clean these people, give them a wash, because they came without having had a wash, build them up with good nutrition, and whatever surgical or medical treatment needed, that was provided by the physicians and surgeons of the matter at the time. Incidentally, the physicians and surgeons felt it was an honour to work in the matter. They were teaching in the university, and they didn't charge for their services in the hospital. Neither did the sisters charge for their services. They were connected to the medical school in Cecilia Street. Subsequently, this became University College Dublin later on. So in conjunction with the staff of Cecilia Street, a lot of education was imparted to the medical students by the Mater staff, the medical staff daily, mainly in the wards. And each of the surgeons or physicians had, and there was a list made out, and they knew exactly what class they were to teach and what they were actually to teach them. And it's interesting to see what these people were being taught. Now, taking a big leap forward to 1916, which we're particularly proud of today, 100 years since 1916 and what things happened in the matter. This photograph was taken in 1916. It's actually written on the back of it. So it shows you that the hospital, the front of the hospital hasn't changed very much. This is to show you how much of the hospital got built by 1916. They decided to build the hospital in sections, and what they would do was they'd use whatever money they had to build a section, and then they would start working in that section, and then they would collect more money and build the next section. So they built the Eccles Street section first, and a little bit of the eastern side, but the money ran out on the east. When they were up about 25 feet, they had to discontinue. The building, and they went back to caring for the patients. It went on from there, and they returned eventually to building the rest of the East Wing as soon as they had enough money to do so. And then eventually they built the West Wing, and that was that. There was a group came over from England to inspect what was going on in Dublin, inspect all the hospitals in Dublin, and they asked to see the plans of the matter. And when they saw that the matter was a square, would be a square, and that the north wing would complete that square, they insisted that we leave the north side unbuilt, and it remained unbuilt until the 1930s. The reason for this was that they wanted fresh air to blow through the wards. So they also insisted that we would buy the land in front of the hospital. So there's a triangle of land which was actually larger than it is today. The sisters bought that too because the prevailing wind was blowing through that park on the front of the hospital, and it was to blow through the front windows there of the hospital and out the other side, right across and away from the hospital. And that was the thinking. So in very old photographs you see the ladies sitting up in bed with their hats on. So I'd say there was a fair bit of ventilation going through the hospital, and it probably there wasn't that much heat either because they only had a fire at either end of the ward, and this was how the ladies kept their heads warm. So, just to show what wasn't built, mainly because they didn't have enough money, there was to be a clock tower above the entrance into the hospital, and it would have cost a further £2,000 at the time, and they felt they couldn't afford that, so they didn't build it. There was to be a bell tower, and this was also to be in some way connected with ventilation of the ward. That didn't get built. And there's a very nice statue. The plinth for that statue is still above the door. It was a statue depicting Our Lady of Mercy with sick people around her. And none of those things got built, and the newspapers of the day criticised that, because they said that really, if we had made a bigger effort, somebody would have given us the money to build all these little extra things. They thought they'd come back later on and build these things, and in fact they were never built. And sometimes I stand and look, and I think it is a pity that they weren't built, but it's too late now to do anything about it. In 1916, the Mater is situated a short distance from O'Connell Street. It's about 15 to 20 minutes walk, just downhill all the way to O'Connell Street. The hospital staff, fortunately for us, were all resident in the hospital in 1916, except the senior medical staff. So with everybody, even the porters were resident in the hospital. So it made it kind of self-contained in its own way. There were 380 to 400 beds, all full at the time, and that became a little bit of a problem because they were told to clear one floor completely to take in people who were injured as a result of the fighting in 1916. The emergency department was very small, and the mortuary chapel was too small. So they added on a little bit of St. Aloysius ward, which is down on the west wing, and they made one part of it a sort of a small mortuary chapel and an emergency room there for any extra patients. But all the time, they didn't really have enough space for the numbers and the rate at which people came in. This is just to show you where the emergency department in those days was. And one of the advantages that the Mater had was that they had their own farm. So that meant that come what may, they had food. Because the food situation in 1916 during the fighting was very grim and there was very little available. But the sisters had their farm and they were able to use some of the produce of that farm. So they never ran out of food at any stage during that period. Just to show where it is, the North Circular Road is at the back of the hospital there. And the land really that the sisters bought, they bought 4 acres of land, ran from Eccles Street, which is here, well, that's Phibsborough, is up that direction where the fighting started, and the front of the hospital then is on Eccles Street. So it's a section of the land that was between Eccles Street and the North Circular Road. And the main thing is when you just look at the size of the emergency department, because it wasn't very large beyond what you can see in the picture there, it did mean that at the rate they were coming in, they were very short of space. The Rising took the hospital by surprise, and arrangements had to be worked out very quickly. But they had great women who could work out plans quicker than anybody else could. The Mater wasn't readily available to the injured people from O'Connell Street because the police, the last place they wanted people to escape to was the matter. It was very big, and they were afraid that they would never find them if they got into the matter. So they instead they threw a cordon along Parnell Street, and that kept a lot of people, except those who knew the area, and they knew how to get up to the matter. We did get them. Shooting on the north side started in Phibsborough at the barricades on the North Circular Road, and gradually it moved towards the matter, Eccles Street and Berkeley Road area. The noise got worse and worse, and this really frightened the patients. Patients and staff in the hospital became very scared and frightened, fearing that they would be shot. The first patients to arrive at the emergency department were brought from Phibsborough with gunshot wounds, and indeed practically all of the patients who were admitted at that time were suffering from gunshot wounds in some place or other. In the first 48 hours, that's from half of Monday to half of Wednesday, there were 50 wounded and 18 dead brought in to the hospital, into the emergency department. This is what the wards looked like. The skirts on the nurses were very long, and they had electric light by then. From 1902, they had electricity. Before that, the place was lit by gas. It's just to give you a rough idea. However, during the 1916 rising, the electricity ceased, there was no gas, and there was no telephone. There was a telephone at the very beginning, and then suddenly that got cut. They actually cut it off. It wasn't as if it failed, it was cut off. And this created a terrible problem to them. Running a hospital with no light is not the easiest thing in the world. On Easter Monday afternoon, the senior surgical staff were still working when the injured began to arrive. Surgeon Alec Blaney, who was senior surgeon, Henry Barnable, a surgeon, Morris Hayes, a physician, and Patrick O'Farrell, the anaesthetist, were all finishing their routine service, and they elected to stay back. The newspapers featured that, and they put it on the newspapers. I think they admired the fact that they worked right through the night. So they agreed to keep working, and indeed they worked all through the week. Orders came from the Reverend Mother, who was the charge d'affaires, not to delay the patients in the emergency department. The order was take the shoes and socks off them and send them up to the wards where they would be prepared for surgery immediately. And all the staff remained on duty to help out. When the electricity failed, Surgeon Blaney sent to the sacristy for some candles. All the wards by then were being lit by candles until the power eventually was restored. This is a medical ward. And you can see the lady on the left-hand side has her hat on. The nurse is with her there. They're all in their clothes because the wards weren't as warm as they would be nowadays. During the week of the rising, the food ran short in general. The shops were empty, and people were coming in very hungry to the place. The Mater had the farm, and enough food in stock to feed the patient and the staff. The problems which arose in general in the hospital: no electricity. This meant no lifts to bring the patients to the theatre. They had to carry them, and we all know that it's a good flight, 2 flights of stairs all the way up to the theatre. No light, candles being used, no means of sterilising theatre equipment. They were washed with soap and water, the equipment, and they were reused. Some equipment needing electricity could not be used at all, things like suction pumps and things like that. There were no telephones, so there was no communication regarding supplies. No gas, so cooking had to be suspended, and they were given food, whatever food they had cooked, and any other food that they could give them. And the laboratory work, more or less, came to a halt. There was also bread and milk was the main staple diet at that time for people in Dublin. And although we managed to keep the bread supply, one patient did say that it was the same bread they were getting at the end of the week that they had got at the beginning of the week, and that could be so. There was atrocious noise outside and the patients were very frightened. Discharged patients had to remain in the hospital. They couldn't go home. And a big problem, and it was really a serious problem, there was no space available for the dead, and they were coming in huge numbers. A second mortuary room was opened on the ground floor. Part of a ward was made available near the casualty to try and accommodate the increasing number of unidentifiable dead bodies. There were no coffins available in the city, and that was made worse by the fact that most of the coffins they normally got were coming from one of the places in Gardner Street, and that place was blown up and the man in charge of it was shot. So they didn't quite know what to do about that. In one of the newspapers I read an account of them talking about a lorry. The reporter said he was coming out of the matter, and there was a lorry coming out, and when he looked into the back of the lorry, it was full of unidentified remains rolled up in sheets, and obviously they were sending them down to the city morgue to try and make space for more remains in the matter. It was a very serious situation. These were just a list of the names in the first couple of days, so you can see that most of them came from this area, and the youngest of them there is John Healy, second down. He was only 14. He was actually shot dead just round the corner from the hospital near the library there. That's where he was shot. And James Kelly, another Boy Scout, was only 15. They were all shot within the vicinity of the hospital, and they were brought in dead to the hospital, in addition then to all the ones who were injured. It was grim, to say the least. During the week, a number of injured soldiers were brought to the accident room. They didn't expect that that would kind of happen, but it did. I suppose they had to bring them somewhere. 2 of them were dead on arrival, but when they went to fix them up, they found that they still had bombs on them, and this created a lot of anxiety. They contacted the military authority to find out what would they do, patients with a bomb on them, and they suggested that the equipment should be buried in the garden for safety until it could be collected. I often wonder, the nearest garden to them would have been the convent garden. There was actually a door from the casualty at that stage into the convent garden, and it would make me a bit nervous now digging up the convent garden for fear that those bombs could still be there. Didn't hear that they were ever removed, but I presume that Reverend Mother made sure that they were. It was grim, to say the least. On the Wednesday night during Easter week at about 10, a nun in a nearby convent decided to open the window to see for herself what was happening outside. The noise was unbelievable, and this unfortunate nun, she got a bullet through her ear and head, and she was brought by ambulance to the Mater, but she died a few days later. It was sad when you think of it. This is just the note that came with one of the patients to give you a rough idea when the ambulance called, and it's saying that a splinter of a bomb under the scalp, so another head injury. Now I can't tell you whether this patient lived or died. And that's about it. I hope I've given you some idea as to what it was like to be working here in the Mater during 1916. They did great work, and I think we have a lot to be grateful to them at that time, staff and the sisters, and indeed the patients as well. Thank you very much for listening to me.